Pleased to host Peg Tyre, speaking about education and in general. Education is one of humanity's highest callings, and for decades, education theorists and educational psychologists have pondered the best ways to educate our youth. In an era of increasing standardization and more push towards national standards for educational accountability, how can we ensure that individual learning styles are recognized and that everyone has a chance to succeed? And sometimes, of course, children succeed or fail no matter the environment that they're in. Peg Tyre enters this dialogue with her book, which is entitled The Trouble with Boys, a surprising report card on our sons, their problems at school, and what educators and parents must do to help. This book arose out of Peg's cover story for Newsweek magazine in 2006 and chronicles recent trends in the education of boys, both as they relate to the education of girls and as it relates to our society's educational system generally. This book has garnered rave reviews from both psychologists and educators alike, including the noted educational psychologist James Garabino, whose work I studied before back when I was a psych major at Illinois. Peg herself has spent 2 decades in journalism, both as a feature writer at New York Magazine, a reporter at New York Newsday, an on-air correspondent for CNN, and most recently as a senior staff writer for Newsweek, focusing on social issues and education. She's won numerous awards from the Overseas Press Club, the New York Press Club, the Association for Women in Communications. The list goes on. And speaking to us today, we'll be focused on the book. Of course, there will be time afterwards for any questions and answers. We do ask that you use the Q&A mics for the benefit of our virtual and YouTube audiences. And then the final bit of trivia about Peg is that she graduated from Brown University, and she's even taught at Columbia and Harvard. And she's also married to the novelist Peter Blauner. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Peg. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Very sweet. Hi, I'm Peg Tyre. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. All right. Thanks very much, Cliff, for welcoming me here and for showing up, taking your lunch hour to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about the book that I wrote, how I came to write it, and why I think it's a useful book for parents who care deeply about education, parents of sons, and also for teachers. So I came to write this book. I myself am a grateful beneficiary of the feminist movement. I grew up on the literature of reviving Ophelia and had this idea, strong ideas about how girls are shortchanged in education and how we look very closely for the crisis of self-esteem that girls struggle through in their middle school years. And I ended up covering education for 7 years for Newsweek. And in that time, I was in the classroom a great deal. And I was really looking for the struggles that girls faced. I try not to be a biased reporter, but as I am what I am, and we all have our biases. And I wasn't really looking for the issues that affect boys. And it wasn't until I was actually in classrooms for a few years that I started to notice a few things. I knew that African-American boys, poor African-American boys, just as a demographic, were doing very poorly and had been doing very poorly for many, many years. And those struggles are well documented. But in classrooms, I started to notice that the kids who were struggling, who were at the bottom of the class, were disproportionately boys. And that seemed to hold true no matter what sort of class I was in, whether it was in a poor African-American community or a middle-class community or an affluent community. And I started to notice that over time. But when you cover education, it's very hard to pick out a national trend because education is very fragmented and very local. And so I didn't rush into it. So I started sort of creating a dossier a little bit, thinking about the evidence that would suggest that boys are struggling. And I was interviewing a headmaster at a very high-end private school in Manhattan, and not talking about boys, just talking about other educational issues. And he told me that they were very concerned about the kids in the lowest quartile, the kids who really were falling to the bottom of their very rigorous program and staying there. Now, these kids are not unintelligent. They have a very rigorous application process. and they do some rigorous sorting before they let children in. So he had commissioned a research project and tried to find the common element for all these kids who are at the bottom of the class at this very elite private school. And what he found is that they weren't the arty kids, they weren't the goths, they weren't the jocks, they weren't the scholarship kids or the richy riches. The only thing that they had in common was that all but one, they were male. And he just told me about this. He was quite surprised at the results that he got, but it really planted a seed in my head, and I started to think, well, if this is happening to poor African-American boys, that they're really struggling in school. And now we see at the most affluent end of the spectrum, anecdotally, of course, that boys are struggling. What could I be looking at? So I went, because I'm a national reporter, what I think about things, what I see, anecdotes that I run across are pretty much meaningless to a reader. I'm not the kind of reporter who takes my temperature and tells you the weather. In order for me to do my job, I have to triangulate out with a great deal of research and data. So I started to look at the data associated with boys, and I was very, very surprised. What I found is that it starts very young, that in preschool, boys are expelled at 5 times the rates of girls. When they get into first grade, they're retained at twice the rates of girls. They're identified as having behavioral issues at 3 times the rates of girls. They're identified as having ADHD problems, attention problems, at twice the rates of girls. I started to look at rates at which boys were being medicated for ADHD, and I found that in some communities, in affluent communities, the number was about 20% in some areas. And in one unpublished study was 35%. So 35% of elementary school boys were taking attention-enhancing medication. Then when they get into middle school and high school, our federal government takes in all this data, and it's readily available to you. But I'll tell you what I saw. In middle school and high school, boys do less homework. They get the overwhelming number of C's and D's. There are fewer boys on the college track. And it will be no surprise to you after hearing all these data points that there are now 2.5 million more girls in college than boys. So I found in the whole that to be a fairly arresting portrait of what's happening to boys in school. So I started researching a cover story that I did in January of 2006 for Newsweek. And the cover story was about about the problem and what some schools across the country were doing to address it. And I've been a reporter, I'll just tell you as a aside, for about 20 some odd years. And I've done a lot of big stories. I've covered the FBI, and I've done a lot of investigative work, and I've won a lot of prizes. When I published this cover story for Newsweek, the response to it was beyond anything I've ever published or spoken about anywhere. I have literally thousands of emails from parents who wrote me to say, "Thank you for writing about the central drama of our family lives. My son is barely getting into community college and my daughter's at Duke. And my question is, what did I do wrong?" And I got letter after letter after letter like this. I also got some pushback from members of the feminist, mostly academic feminist community, who felt that this was a very bad subject to tackle, and that by talking about boys, we were really taking attention away from girls and the struggles of girls. And I have to say, just personally, that was very hard for me because, as I said, my orientation is as a beneficiary of the feminist movement. So I had to look very closely at my argument and see whether they were right about that. And I'll tell you a little bit later why I think this is actually a very evolved position to be taking. But I did get one great letter from a woman who wrote, and she said that the cover story was called "The Boy Crisis," and this woman wrote in and she said, women have been dominated by men for thousands of years, and now we're on top for like a nanosecond, and it's a crisis? And I really laughed because I could relate to that. But I know as an education reporter that education is a very, very important, educational attainment is very important in our culture. You know, I don't have to tell you this, that our economy is changing, and that educational attainment gives us resilience in the workplace. And it gives us, of course, the more education you get, the higher your income is likely to be. But it also fundamentally changes our family lives. What we're seeing now is we're seeing sort of a bifurcation between men and women. We're seeing women with much higher educational attainment and men with lower educational attainment. And in this book, I argue that this is one of those seismic changes in culture that's going to really change the way our children mate and marry, where they live, who educates their children, whether they'll be able to retire. It'll change the fabric of our culture if this is allowed to continue and the gender gap is allowed to continue to grow. I'm sort of agnostic about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe it's the evolution of how we are as human beings. Maybe this is a new kind of social order asserting itself. But I will tell you, that's sort of a macro view. I will tell you in the micro view, there's a lot of parents and a lot of educators who are extremely concerned about this because their job is to reach every student. And they know, the teachers know, that they're not reaching a lot of boys. So I guess the question is, as I looked at the response that I got from that cover story, the question to me was, and the question that was put to me from so many parents is, why is this happening? What's different now about the way that we raise our sons, the way we educate our sons, the messages they get from the community that could be conferring this disadvantage on young males? And let me just say that it's not every boy who's struggling. Everywhere I look, in all the data, you see a thin margin of high-performing boys. So it's not every single boy. But in the main, overall, boys are much more likely to be disproportionately at the bottom of the class. So what's changed? Back in the 70s and in the 80s, it was very different, okay? There were many more, in the 70s, many more men than women who went to college. And I looked back, and a lot of people in these letters that I got and conversations that I got, people would say, well, it was much better before the feminist movement. And I looked hard at that, even though I do have my own biases. I looked hard as, could that be right? But what I found is that there was no golden age of education for boys. Back in the 70s, we educated for college rich white boys, and we didn't have a national mandate to educate everyone. And so our goals for education have changed, and that means back in the 70s, we left a lot of young men behind and almost all women behind, but that was sort of okay because people could graduate from high school, not go to college. But men, for instance, in the traditional roles that ruled at the time, they could still get high-paying jobs in which they could support a family and children. Those jobs don't exist anymore. There is ever-shrinking manufacturing sector, ever-shrinking agricultural sector. It's very hard to get a job without any college in which you can support a family. So looking back on what changed, I thought, could we point a finger at the feminist movement? And what I really came away with is, you can if you want, but I think that's a fake argument. I think what's really changed is that we raise our children differently and we educate our children differently. And let me try and unpack that a little bit and tell you what I found in my book. And I'm just touching upon the causality that I find for this problem, but in the book, I lay out a lot of data on each of these points, and so there's a way for you to get more information, if you want it, about each of the things that I'm saying. So how do we raise our kids differently? Well, it used to be there was a time when kids had a lot of free play, that adults didn't really enter much into the world of children. and they had a lot of free, unstructured time. And that really doesn't exist anymore, because now we have this idea that in order for children to really reach their full potential, we want to give them a lot of experiences early on in order for them to be proficient in something that captures their passion later on. Now, there's a lot of people who say, oh, the parents, more finger wagging. Oh, the feminists, oh, the parents today, they structure their kids too much. But listen, when you look at that, parents do that for a very good reason. In the 90s, it was called the decade of the brain. And what we learned from seeing this new kind of technology, fMRI, we learned that children's brains are much more active than we ever thought they were. And so there was this big 0 to 3 movement, which was very, very strong in California, which told parents, your children are not just dormant intellectually, they actually can learn a lot in these early years. And that's true. But the message morphed. The message was directed more at poor families who plopped their kids in front of television, and not really middle-class families who were doing pretty much what they needed to do anyway to make their kids as intellectually alert as they needed to be. But of course, middle-class parents heard that message, and the message morphed from being that there's a window that opens earlier than we thought for intellectual growth for children. But what they heard was that the window opens and then it shuts. So that if you don't bring your children to certain experiences early on, then they may never really achieve proficiency in those experiences. And language, something that we hear all the time, is a good example of that. If children try and learn a language earlier in life, they're more likely to be fluent than if they try later on. We all know this, okay? Language seems to be the one exception. As it turns out, looking back on that science, what we find is that, yes, the window opens earlier, but it doesn't really shut. There is no end of learning. There is no time when, if you don't have an experience by a certain age, you can still be proficient. But parents have this idea that you're either on the bus or off the bus to academic success by the time you're 4. And so we laugh, but then you take your kid to preschool and you actually see that those ideas completely inform the program that your 4-year-old is experiencing. You have 4-year-olds who are doing computation, who are getting worksheets, who are asked to sit down, hold a pencil. And these are very, very new ideas. And I suggest to you that there's very good research, and I put this in the book, there's very good research to suggest that this rigorous academic approach to raising young children, the end of structured play and introducing them to academics very early, is not so great for a lot of kids. And most of those kids who it's not so great for are boys. So what you see when you look at the data over time is you see that this amped up academics creates a sort of advantage for a few years, and then actually it flattens out. But the kids who do worse from academic experiences early on are boys. So academic experiences, it turns out, can actually depress the academic achievement of boys later on in school. And I found that to be a very interesting data set, and I thought I would certainly have liked to have known that. So I write about that a great deal, about those changes in our thinking about parenting and our thinking about those very early educational experiences. Now, when your child goes to kindergarten has changed a lot. If you talk to veteran teachers, they'll tell you that what they once taught in 3rd grade, they now routinely teach in 1st grade and sometimes in kindergarten. I just had an email exchange with a teacher in upstate New York who said the big debate at their school is whether to have keyboarding for kindergartners. Now, I thought y'all would like that, being from Google, but there's such a push down in academics that kindergarten teachers and 1st grade teachers, the early education people, they understand that we've pushed beyond the cusp of what's natural in human development, and that our ideas are moving faster than what children are actually capable of. So when your child gets into 1st grade, and especially if you have a boy, what the program is may be very much at odds with what his natural development is. And at the same time, we have this push down of academics. Teachers aren't just doing this to be evil. They are under a great deal of pressure to meet the state standards, which is something we all agreed on as a nation that there should be state standards. Every state sets their own standards. In order for states to get schools and districts to get federal money, they have to meet those standards. But that means that the curriculum has gotten very, very narrow. So Margaret Spellings, the Secretary of Education, she says laughingly, what gets tested gets taught. And when I'm in schools, I don't see a lot of laughing going on around that, because in many communities, schools have become sort of test prep factories. And indeed, what gets tested gets taught. What gets tested is English and math. And so the day is devoted to English and math and acquiring skills that the state says you must acquire. The teachers have less and less leeway to break away from the daily schedule that's set up for them of what material they have to cover. So things like science, history, art, music. History, did I mention history? It's all going away because kids have to focus on passing the state standards. And while the test actually happens in 4th grade, the districts push it down so that they test them at frequent intervals to make sure that they're on the track to then pass those high stakes tests. And I think that kind of rote learning and that kind of test-driven learning is very bad for a lot of kids. But I think what we're seeing now is that boys are sort of the canaries in the mine for this. They're less compliant and they won't do it. And they have a harder time doing it. And they attract most of the negative attention because they're not happy doing it. Another thing that I think is one of the big issues in why boys fail, especially early on, is that the schedules have changed for children. And because of this emphasis on testing, we've seen recess shrink. And in 39% of kindergartners, 39% of first graders in this country get 20 minutes or less of recess a day. Okay, they're 7, they're in school all day, it's 20 minutes or less. If you're a parent, you can raise your hand if you think that's a good idea. No hands are raised. This is a very poor idea, all right? What we see is as the rates and frequency of recess has dropped, the rise in ADHD medication it almost runs completely counter to it. So as we give them less opportunity for movement, we identify them as having learning disabilities and attention issues more. And you can't really make a one-on-one relation, but you have to step back and say, maybe what we're looking at is connected, and maybe what we're doing is we're fixing the boy instead of trying to fix the school. Because you can take your child in for ADHD medication, and the physician, if you even see a physician, will never actually ask you, how much free play do they get? How much recess do they get? When I talk to parents, when I'm in a school and I talk to parents of 1st and 2nd and 3rd graders, and I ask them, how much recess does your child get? They say, oh, there's recess, even when there's not. It's not an issue that parents are particularly attentive to, and I suggest to you that they need to be. Because I think what we're doing is that we're creating developmentally inappropriate school situations, especially in early education. Now, because I'm sort of a data person, I wanted to know, I'll tell you, I had a lot of fun with this book. I asked myself at a certain point, I said, well, you think that boys need to move around more, right? You'd think that this would affect boys not having as much recess. But maybe that's just the idea that I have about gender. And I have to, in this whole book, I have to be super careful, I was super careful, not to put what I think about gender on the page. Like, you don't really care about my ideas. What you really want to see is what we know from social science. So I really went out of my way to be very careful about making assumptions. And when I had an inkling about something, or I found myself making an assumption, I'd try and back it up with people who were actually doing the science. So I asked myself, why would this matter to boys? Why would it affect boys more than girls? And I found this mad scientist in Canada who I just love. And he said the same thing. He asked himself, do boys move around more than girls? And his assumption, his hypothesis was yes. But he looked at the literature and he didn't find that there was any conclusive evidence as to whether boys move around more than girls. Little boys move around more than little girls. So he found an engineer from the old Timex company, and he jury-rigged, he didn't have a big grant, so he jury-rigged these little Timex watches to be actimeters, to be motion sensor machines, and he sent these little kids out to play. I love this guy. And in fact, and then he measured it all and he graphed it. And in fact, he found that boys do move around more than girls. A bit. They move around. It's identifiable. You can see the difference, okay? But when he graphed it, what he found is that the outliers, the ones who really move around a lot, the ones who have ants in their pants, are always boys. And the more sedentary people, children on the other side, are invariably girls. And so I found that very interesting, especially if you try and think about what that would mean in a school setting. It means that when a teacher's trying to do like circle time, and she says, sit down, Jose, don't wiggle around, Philip, stop that, Mark. All that negative attention is going to those little boys because their natural development has them move around more. It's not that they're trying to be bad, it's that when you look at how much children move, the outliers are going to be boys, and those are the ones who are going to be the complete focus of the negative attention in school. So I found that preschool is a very difficult time for a lot of young males. And when you look at those college numbers, so there's about, our college split now is about 60-40. 60% of our undergraduates are women, 40% are male. And when you go to those colleges, you ask the college presidents, why is this? Why do you have so many more girls than boys? And they all point to preschool, and they all point to early educational experiences. And they said to me, that's where, it's a pipeline. There's a pipeline that carries all children from preschool to college. And you need to look at those places early on where boys are falling out of the pipeline. So I think the early educational experience is a very difficult one for some boys, and I think that education becomes something very negative in their mind because of these experiences, and that they begin to disengage and they start talking about school being girly. And I think that's an attitude that kind of builds on itself into middle school, where a few things also really crop up for boys, and I'll tell you what they are. There's a few things that hang middle school boys up. One of them is handwriting, which teachers call the old graphomotor skills. And boys don't have as good handwriting as girls in a lot of cases. But handwriting neatness becomes one of the virtues that allows you to get an A. So if your hand can't actually do it, not writing, if you can writing, you can think your thoughts and have them come out your hand. That's not what they're grading you on. They're grading you on how it actually looks. And for a lot of boys, those skills come a little bit later. Then there's organization. So again, I thought, well, boys seem a little less organized than girls. So I went to the people who actually work with, at New York University, who actually work with kids who have neurological problems and who they're taking the extreme end of disorganized kids. And I asked them to talk to me about gender difference, and they said that many boys are naturally less organized. Not every boy, but when you look at the kids who are not clinical, subclinical, who struggle with organization, it's a young male fraternity, okay? It's boys who struggle with organization. Some girls do, mostly boys. So when you're in middle school and you're trying to control a paper flow, and you're being graded on your neatness, and you're being graded on your organization, I think that's a way in which boys really struggle. And then when we start scratching our heads when they're freshmen and wonder why boys aren't on the college track, we have to look at the pipeline, the way that we've pushed them out all along the way, from preschool to middle school. Now, let me talk a little bit about literacy. It used to be that girls were better in reading and writing, and boys were better at math and science. That was true until about the 1982. And at that point, we started to really encourage girls in math and science. And they heard it, and they got it. And teachers started promoting them in math and science, encouraging them, saying, you can do this. And girls caught up. And so now when you look at the national testing, you see that girls and boys are about the same in math and science. Girls take more chemistry classes, they take more biology classes. They're not as fully represented in physics and computer science, but they have for most science classes and most math classes caught up, except for the very advanced math as well. They're not fully represented there. But generally in the college prep track, they take more college prep science and math courses than boys. Boys have always been behind in reading, and they've actually gone backwards in writing. So this at a time when the SAT, which is America's great sorting machine, and the SAT is the great proxy by which we sort children, we've added a writing component at the same time that there is an ever-widening gap in writing between writing for girls and writing for boys. And yet, when you talk about who needs support in school, there's a great deal of attention paid and a great deal of corporate money for promoting girls in math and science, and I'm all for that, don't get me wrong. But when you talk about the gap between boys and girls in reading and writing, there's sort of radio silence about it. We don't talk about that. And my question is, and I talk about this a great deal in the book, why would that be? Why don't we talk about reading and writing for boys? Writing and reading have become the master virtues for our entire curriculum. We now have a literacy-soaked curriculum from first grade through college, okay? Yet, we allow this gap to exist and for writing grow even larger for boys and girls. And we don't want to talk about this? It seems very interesting to me. What I kind of thought after a while is that maybe there's kind of a taboo about this. Like maybe there's a taboo about talking. I write about this a fair bit in the book, that we have these kind of old Victorian ideas about boys and girls, and it's okay for our girls to be frail. It's okay for them to have crises of self-esteem and eating disorders. I mean, it's not okay for them to have eating disorders, but we're okay as a society to talk about it because it's okay for girls to be frail. But there's a way in which we want our boys to be fine. And so we tell each other they are fine because in our hearts, we don't want them to be frail. We want them to be the Marlboro Man. And even when we talk about the friendships between boys, we champion the friendships between girls. We understand the sisterhood of the traveling pants, Sex in the City. We understand as a culture that the connections between girls insulate them psychologically from the ups and downs of life, from the hardships, right? We understand that when girls have a good friend, it's great for them. But when boys are together, okay, I've seen boys sit a seat apart in the movie theater because they didn't want people to think they're gay. I mean, they're so paranoid about even being friends with each other. We don't champion boys' friendships in the same way. When we see a group of boys walking down the street, teenage boys walking down the street together, we don't think of them as the male equivalent of the sisterhood of the traveling pants. We think, uh-oh, what are they up to, right? And so I think that there's a way in which our culture and our community now really doesn't reinforce what boys need. I talked to a wonderful psychologist, a human development specialist, and she is a graduate student of Carol Gilligan, who's one of the big feminist thinkers on education and on girls. And at Carol Gilligan's suggestion, she did her work on boys. And she wanted to know if it was true that boys don't really express their feelings as much as girls. One of the old aphorisms of our culture, right? This is what we say to each other. Men are not as in touch with their feelings. And what she found is very interesting to me. And she hasn't gotten her research published yet because, well, I'll leave that to you. But what she found is that, in fact, boys do talk about their feelings, but they don't talk about them in the way that girls talk about them. They're not disclosing in the way that girls are disclosing about their feelings. If you talk to girls, they'll tell you about their friends, their friends' boyfriends, their friends' parents, what their friends' parents said to their boyfriends. They're very relational in the way that they speak and comfortable in that medium. And boys speak in a very different way about their friendships, but not in a way that to suggest they don't have them or that doesn't mean a lot to them. They just speak about them differently. And yet as a society, we're kind of keen to ignore that what we know in social science is that for boys and girls, having a social network provides a protective effect for all children. And yet we champion it for girls and we ignore it for boys. So I'm going to just wind up real quick and end on one note and then take your questions. All right. What question comes up for me a lot is, what can we do about this? We have this ever-widening gap between boys and girls in education. We have ways in which schools are very hard on boys, and yet we're almost afraid to talk about it because we don't want to seem like we're part of the backlash, right? And my book is an attempt, and I hope you get a chance to take a look. My book is an attempt to have a more nuanced dialogue about what's actually happening to our young males. What I learned in women's studies classes is that at Brown is that education should be available to all children. And I believe that that's actually the most evolved position that you can take, and that we shouldn't look at gender as a seesaw, that boys are up and girls are down, girls are up and boys are down. It's a double helix, really. Their fates are intertwined. And by ignoring this very large gender gap, we actually disadvantage our girls. If any of you are old enough to have children applying to college, you'll find that when girls apply to private universities, they run smack into the wall created by this leaky pipeline of boys. What happens is private universities gender weight. So they get many more applications from girls and fewer applications from boys. And so what girls from affluent families begin to realize when they're 17 is that they've thrown themselves into a scholastic system that said the world is your oyster. You can go, you can do anything. But when it comes to applying to colleges, in fact, they compete against each other. Girls compete against girls. And that boys, privileged, usually white, affluent boys, are given a thumb on the scale when it comes to being accepted at private universities. For me, I find that there's something wrong with that. I think that we shouldn't privilege the most privileged people, okay? That we should actually have a level playing field, especially in college applications. But by ignoring this problem all along, by pretending that it's part of a backlash or suggesting it's part of a backlash argument, we actually disadvantage our girls in the end. So my hope is that people who read this book, parents of sons and teachers of children, of all kinds of children, will begin to have this dialogue in their schools. If you look, you will find that there is a gender, in any school that your child goes to, that there is a gender gap in reading and writing between boys and girls. If you go to a more middle class school or a working class school, you'll find that there's probably a gender gap by every measurable marker. But we need to start having this conversation. There are schools who are taking this very seriously, who are and making great progress in this issue. They tend to be schools that work with very poor African American children, and also on the very affluent end, and very affluent private schools are all over this issue, because the poor African American boys are falling off a cliff, and the affluent families who support those affluent schools, they know it's happening and they demand better. So there's ways in which schools are addressing this and having some very good results, helping boys without hurting girls. What they find when they try and help the boys is that what's good for boys is often very good for girls, and that it advantages girls as well. And that, I think, is a very hopeful sign indeed. So what I'd like to do now is take your questions if you have any. Yeah. I think you have to talk in the microphone.
Did you find anything about all boys schools or all girls schools?
That's a very good question. And one of the many questions that many times came up from the parents who've emailed me. I looked at the data, and here's what I'll tell you. Rich families, from almost the time we have had education, rich families who have a choice have exercised the choice to send their children to single gender academies, going back to sort of courtly England, okay? But when you look at the data, single-sex schools seem to advantage girls and poor African-American boys. But I don't find any data that suggests it provides an advantage for middle-class kids or affluent kids. Rich people have always done it. I don't discount that. I want to give you the historical perspective as well. It could be we'll be getting more data because there's a big push on now to take public schools and public money and divide them into single gender academies. But there's no good data to suggest it's a silver bullet for boys.
This is fascinating, and it's a problem I take very seriously. And I want to ask a question or two that's really from the devil's advocate point of view. Very much like the woman who said, oh, girls are on top for 20 minutes and suddenly it's a crisis.
Right.
There's a point of view that would say, look, we took the brakes off for girls. We created a level playing field. It turns out the girls are better at organization, and they read and they write better. And maybe that's the way it is. And maybe they belong in college, and the boys belong, not all boys and not all girls by any means, but the boys belong doing something very different, rather than rearranging the schools to create a predetermined outcome of 50-50. So the question is, how would you be able to tell if that were true, and what is the desired outcome?
Well, that's a good point, because your question really goes to the idea of school as being a mechanism of social engineering. And I myself am very wary of that, because who makes the decisions about who should be on top and who should be on the bottom, right? And you're right, that this is, for the first time, we actually have sort of taken the shackles off of girls and let them go. And you know what? They hear it. They're doing it, right? But at the same time, I would argue that the changes in our schools in the last 7 years, the push down in academics, the narrowing of education, the dropping of recess, the emphasis on organization, which is far different than anything I experienced or people who were in middle school 7 years ago have experienced. It's become much more heightened. The ways in which we've changed our schools to respond to this environment right now are disadvantaging boys and creating this problem. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's okay. Maybe the generations that are below us will have high earning women and low earning men. That's actually already happening in couples in the lower middle class, like the working middle class and the working class. But at the same time, as parents, I think we want education. We see what education confers for each individual and how important it is. So, of course, we want to balance the idea of social engineering, and maybe you're right, maybe it's going to be women are going to rule, and maybe that could be okay. Whenever I suggest this to, affluent communities, I always say, well, maybe you should just get a home ec course for your guys, because how many, beers can you drink? How long can you sit on that couch? And then everyone gets really touchy about it. But maybe we should, if we're really okay with this, gender imbalance in education, maybe we need to prepare them for this. Maybe we should take that into consideration. So thanks for your question.
So your comments on standardized testing. As a parent, I agree, and I've seen it happen, that they teach to the test and that schools become little test factories. But on the other hand, as somebody who recently moved to the US and bought a house, the existence of standardized testing was a great boon for figuring out where I wanted to be, and I doubt that educational administrators are going to let standardized testing go anytime soon. So how do we resolve this dilemma?
See, that's the thing. We're the architect of our own demise, right? I mean, our house values are tied to the test scores of our schools, and yet we see what's happening to our children, right? So there's so many junctures in writing this book when I wanted to get on my little soapbox and be like, you're to blame, you're to really point fingers. But actually, we're colluding in the situation that makes our kids cry when they come home from school in 4th grade and say, I'm stupid, I couldn't pass this test. I mean, look, I think that testing is a good thing. I know it's really unpopular to say, but I'm actually a supporter of No Child Left Behind. I know, no one else, just me. But and I realize that it's a flawed law, and I realize that it needs to be overhauled. But when you spend as much time as I do in poor schools, and you see the egregious way that we were educating poor children compared to middle class schools, you can't believe it. You can't believe it's America. Like, it's so shockingly different, right? So I actually believe in standards and accountability and all that claptrap that they talk, that jargon. I do. But I think that the pendulum has swung so far in one direction that we've sort of reached the crest of it, that their teachers and principals tell me that there's no days that they're not preparing for a test. Like, we can't add another test, that's what they say. So I think that we need to find a healthier balance. And I'll tell you that healthier balance is going to come more quickly for affluent kids than it is for poor kids, because teachers in poor schools, they're like the NASCAR pit crew. They're just trying to like slap some wheels on those kids and get them into the next grade. They're so working against the social disadvantages that poverty confers on those children that there's not a lot of leeway to really do the warm, touchy-feely stuff that we like to see in our schools. So I think that for affluent middle class communities, it is going to change. I think that parents see that it's gone as far as it'll go.
Thank you for coming. I had another question coming off of the standardized testing question. I studied your article and this topic a bit in undergrad when I took classes like race, class, and gender in education and education policy. And so I was wondering if a focus on this new gap would bring more calls to question the validity of standardized testing and things like the SAT in college admissions and that sort of thing.
If attention to the gender gap will question the validity of SATs, no, I don't think so. I think that I think that that's happening anyway. I think that there's, the gender gap is sort of one issue in education that's coming more to the fore, and I think equally there's this discontent burbling about using SAT as a proxy for intelligence in the college admissions process. So I don't think the two are connected, but I think that the two things are both happening in education now. And I think we will see a falling away of the SAT as the main sorting instrument.
Hi there. Can you talk a little bit about how after-school programs can be used to address some of these challenges?
Well, I'll tell you what I did see in some schools that are addressing this problem. One was an after-school boys reading club. The problem with boys and reading is that boys don't read, and bet you could have figured that out. And the reason a lot of people think they don't read is that the books they're given are not interesting to them. And so a lot of teachers in early elementary school are female, and they like to have kids read what they like to read, and they gravitate more towards literature that's interesting to them. And it turns out boys are interested in, I have sons, so I'll tell you this from personal experience, they're interested in books that I'm not interested in, like a book that no girl has ever read, the Guinness Book of World Records. No woman has ever opened that. And boys read it like the Talmud, they're just really into it. And also action stories and a lot of swashbuckling stories, like very plot-based stories, biographies, science books. So I saw one school where they ran this sort of it was actually boys, soccer, and reading. So they would go and they'd kick the soccer ball around and get their yayas out after school, and then they would talk about a book that they're all reading. And actually a male teacher ran that reading group, and they talked about it. It was a whole guy kind of experience. But I thought it was amazing because what it really was truly doing, getting the kids to read, associating it with, a time of great, when your endorphins are rising after you've moved around, so a lot of pleasure. But also it showed the kids, the boys, what it is to be a literate man. We have moms who read books to children, faithfully, but not as many dads do that. Who reads the paper? Who gets caught reading that? Who do the kids see reading the novels? It tends to be women. So to reinforce for young boys that reading is a male activity as well. What does it look like to be a literate male in our culture? I think it's super valuable. I actually thought it was a brilliant idea. They were doing it in Wilmette, which is an affluent school district outside of Chicago. So that was one of the things that come to mind.
So this is more of a practical question. We have two boys who are not yet in preschool. Do you have any advice on what to look for when looking at a preschool, and also later on when looking at elementary school districts?
I think that's a really good question, actually. And from my research, I'll tell you that I think that's a really important decision where you put your child in preschool, because those early decisions, those early experiences are very formative for children. I would be very wary of schools that are academically based, that make a big deal about worksheets. I'd be very wary of a preschool that has worksheets at all for boys. For a lot of kids, many of the, girls as well, but especially for boys. I would look at the physical space and see if it looks like a place where kids can actually move around. I've been in preschools where they have desks lined up, and they consider this to be best practices, desks lined up in a preschool. I would look to see if they have There's a chance for actual physically expressing yourself. I was in a preschool where they had noodles, like a noodle corner where the kids could like get their yayas out with those noodles that you use in a pool, which I thought was a little excessive, but was working for them. There's a big thing now, and I do want to talk about this too. There's a big thing now about don't be aggressive in school. Like, we live in a post-Columbine world, and we want safety for our children more than anything, which is good. But a lot of times that safety message and nonviolent message gets translated into a non-aggression message. Still good, right? I don't want my kids to go to a school where kids are being aggressive. But then it gets into a no fantasy aggression policy, and like none of this. Pew, pew. Like, that's actually kind of actionable in many schools that I've been in. This is considered a behavioral problem, okay? And I will tell you that in my research, what I find from psychologists who work with boys, and this is in the book, that boys, for whatever reason, think a lot and play a lot around violence and around action. And we think that we worry as women that they are actually potential Columbine shooters, but if we really pay attention to what they're doing, they're actually acting out around and playing around issues of courage and valor and things that we actually want for our boys, and yet we say, don't do this, don't go pew, pew. Now, I don't know about you, but my kids shoot each other with celery. You know, I said no guns in the household, and they shot each other with, their toast. They chewed it into a gun and shot each other. So I think that when we put those non-aggression, don't talk about superheroes. That's a big thing in preschools now. You can't talk about superheroes. Well, I know 5-year-olds, and I've had parents of 5-year-olds who say, my son has never seen Spider-Man. All he talks about is Spider-Man. All he thinks about it, he's never seen Spider-Man. He just knows it's in the culture, and he's fascinated with the whole Spider-Man idea. And how do I get him not to do that in preschool? Because there's no superheroes allowed in my son's preschool. I would submit to you that when we tell children to turn that gun into a wand, or to pretend it's a fire hose and not a weapon, what we're really telling them is, you can't be your authentic self here in this preschool. Like, you can't bring what you really are into this school situation. And so I would watch for those attitudes in preschool. I mean, I don't know, you can't exactly grill the preschool people and say, do you play Halo? It's not, that interview is not gonna go well, right? But you do wanna sort of talk to them around ideas of tolerance and tolerance for children's play. Yeah.
So this is at the totally opposite end of the spectrum. I'm applying to business school, and most business schools at this point are 60-40 more men than women, and clearly they're a bit older. Did you do any research in terms of, once those men get to college, do they do better? Do they do worse? Like, where's the drop off there?
Okay, so it's a good question. And actually in business school, in the very highly regarded business schools, it is more men than women. In the second tier business schools, it's equal, and in the lower tier business schools, it's many more women than men. So it's not exactly that clear. When you talk about college retention, when boys do get to college, they drop out in much greater numbers than girls. They play more video games. Surprise. They spend more time at the gym. They do less homework. They're less engaged in the learning process. Those are statistics that the UCLA collects. And so we know that boys don't do as well once they get to college. Again, I'm not talking about every boy. If you get into Stanford, okay, you're probably talking about that thin margin of high-performing boys. That's not the guys I'm talking about. So they do less well. Now, in the workplace, we all know that women drop out a lot more frequently than boys. I laughingly say this is going to be my next book, The Trouble with Girls. I would submit to you that the way the things that we value in high school, the way we commodify our children, and especially our girls, we force certain issues, we champion certain issues like compliance and perfectionism. And I think, looking at this really hurts women in the workplace. Like, if you're taught to be a perfectionist and then you get into the workplace, and especially after you have your first child, you are completely in the headwinds of two contradictory social ideas: work, family. And I think that way that we teach girls is not so great. It's great to get them into college. They're getting into college in much greater numbers. They're doing great. But when they get into the workplace, I think the way we educate them disadvantages them. But that's the trouble with girls. Stay tuned on that one.
Hi, I'm curious if you get a chance to look at data from other countries or other regions, different cultures.
That's a very good question. It seems broadly overall that in any industrialized country where boys and girls have equal access to education, what we see is that there's starting to be this underachievement of men. But I would say to you that this data is it's very hard to make these direct comparisons and to find the data is not very rich. And here's why, because different countries have different mandates for education. For example, India doesn't have the same mandate that we do to educate all our children. So that the data that they keep, the data that we see, is only from a certain class level of children. Where in the United States, we're talking broadly about all children from all different classes. So it's very hard. So it seems that this is across cultures when you have industrialized places, countries with equal access to education, but there's a limit to how much apples and apples comparison you can actually make. But it's a good question.
All right. Or are there any questions from the distributed offices? All right. In that case, Peg, thank you very much for your
Thanks
talk.
very
It
much.
was very great.